Hello, I'm Nathan Robertson, Editor-in-Chief of Current Affairs magazine, and I'm the author of the new book, Responding to the Right, Brief Replies to 25 Conservative Arguments. Today I just want to go through a few of these arguments, 5 of them, and I want to show you what conservatives argue, why it's wrong, how to refute it, how to get around it, and I want to encourage you to pick up the book and read more of my refutations of right-wing arguments. One thing I also do in the book is I show what is common across conservative arguments. I cite the work of Albert Hirschman, who, in The Rhetoric of Reaction, identified some common tropes that he called perversity, futility, and jeopardy. So, perversity would be the idea that some proposed social reform is going to have the opposite of its intended effect. Futility would be the idea that some kind of progressive reform is just not going to accomplish anything. And jeopardy would be the argument that, again, some kind of proposal for how to make society more equal or fair, it's going to jeopardize civilization entirely. And it's going to take all of the progress we've made so far, and it's going to undo it. And I think that you can see those common tropes across a lot of things conservatives say. Usually it's things like, the minimum wage, if you raise it, it will either do nothing, or it will throw a lot of people out of work, or it will destroy the economy, right? So it will have the opposite of the intended effect, or it will do nothing, or it will destroy everything. You see this in the proposals, conservative responses to proposals for climate change mitigation plans. It's going to do nothing, or actually it's going to completely destroy the economy. These tropes of progressives are going to destroy civilization, they've been in force since the abolition movement, since suffrage, since civil rights. Every time there is a movement towards some kind of egalitarian change, there is a conservative response that says this movement is going to destroy everything. It's going to undo the entire fabric of society. You see this a lot in contemporary debates about race and gender. The progressive movement is going to burn down the cities or turn your daughter trans, and that's going to be bad for some reason. There's a lot of fear-based argumentation in conservative rhetoric. But I want to go through the specific talking points that I address in the book and just show you quickly why I think that conservative arguments can sound persuasive, but ultimately can be destroyed pretty quickly. So let's take the first one, which is government is the problem, not the solution. You hear that quite a lot. Ronald Reagan said famously, the scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And I think it's easy to understand why people are persuaded by that. They might have bad experiences at the DMV, they're afraid of state power, quite rationally, but then when you interrogate the talking point closely, you can see that it collapses pretty fast. Let's take what Ronald Reagan said. He said the scariest words in the English language were "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Well, that's true unless you're in, say, a burning building, in which case hearing those words from a firefighter who is from the government and here to help might be the most relieving words in the English language. A lot of times the way the argument is made is through highlighting government failures and overlooking government successes, things that are more mundane, like taking out the trash or keeping the sewer lines running. Another way that conservatives convince you irrationally that government is the problem, not the solution, is that they point to prominent examples of government failure in the United States. So, for example, there's a common tendency to say, look at the terrible US public schools. If we only privatize the schools, we'd have good schools. That's why you should support the charter school movement and vouchers and so forth. This is a deeply irrational argument that crumbles very quickly the moment we realize that there are other countries in the world, and that many of the countries that are beating us in education have world-class public school systems. They are not privatized systems. If we looked around the world and we found that all the privatized systems did really well and all the public systems did really horribly, then we might have an argument that government seemed to be the problem. But actually, it's in the United States where the public schools suck. But it's clearly not because they're public, or else that would be a problem everywhere. In fact, the problem in the United States is that we are just not very good at running our public schools, and we ought to be better. But that doesn't mean we should privatize them. The same is true with arguments on healthcare. When we look around the world, we see that the best systems are ones in which the government actually has a heavy role in making sure that everyone is taken care of by the system. So when the argument is made that government is the problem, not the solution, that involves just selecting the examples that prove your point and overlooking all the ones that contradict it. The next argument is minimum wages are an economic disaster, that if we had a livable wage, lots of people would be thrown out of work. There are 2 points to make here. First, this has actually been studied, and when economists have done the empirical work of going out and looking at the world and seeing what minimum wages do, they find that the effects on employment are minimal. What happens when you raise the minimum wage? Well, actually a lot of people are lifted out of poverty. They're able to, well, live. They are able to pay their rent. They're able to pay for food. This is an example of a perversity argument where a scary story is told about the potential disastrous effects of some kind of social reform, but when we actually look at the facts of the world, we find that it doesn't happen. That's the case frequently with conservative arguments. The United States is a force for good in the world. This is the argument that we are the bringers of freedom and democracy. We are a city upon a hill that the whole rest of the world looks up to for our wonderful freedoms. Well, it turns out when you ask the rest of the world what they think of this argument, they're not too hot on it, and one of the reasons is that they've been on the receiving end of a lot of violence perpetrated by the United States. If you look at the factual record, you'll see that America has a pretty abysmal record of being a force for good in the world. That from the Vietnam War, to the Afghanistan War, to the Iraq War, to all of the governments that we've overthrown, to various clandestine terror activities carried out by the CIA, to the undermining of governments that we don't like and the support for authoritarian regimes, the United States has a record of supporting pretty terrible things for a pretty long time. I think that those who make the argument that the United States is a force for good in the world, they simply want to believe our rhetoric about what we are. They want to believe that we're the good guys because we think that we're the good guys, instead of checking the historical record to see what we've actually done and whether it's been good. I've written plenty of articles on things like Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam that show that the story about America's great goodness and wonderfulness and benevolence can't be maintained when we actually start to examine the record of the uses of US power and its violence abroad over the course of centuries. The welfare state will lead us down the road to serfdom. The right-wing economist Friedrich von Hayek is one of the leading right-wing thinkers of all time, wrote a famous book called The Road to Serfdom during World War II. And one of the things that Hayek argued was that the welfare state was going to lead to Nazi-like totalitarianism. He was specifically talking about Britain. Now, an interesting thing happened after World War II, which is that Britain decisively rejected Hayek's prescription for policy. They didn't go in a laissez-faire capitalist direction. Instead, they threw out Winston Churchill and the Conservatives. They voted in the Labour government, and they introduced a lot of new welfare state policies, including the National Health Service, which became one of the most beloved institutions in the country. And what we saw over the course of the next decades is that however much you might want to criticize the British welfare state, what Hayek predicted would happen didn't in fact happen. It didn't take them down the road to being a totalitarian state like Nazi Germany and some kind of Orwellian dystopia. It just didn't do it. It just turns out that Hayek was wrong, that there is no road to serfdom embedded in social welfare policies. We see them enacted successfully around the world. It just doesn't happen. It's just that one of the leading right-wing economists was just completely wrong in his idea that there was some kind of slippery slope to Nazism in introducing free government healthcare. Just doesn't happen. He's just wrong. So, very easy to refute this. Academia is a radical indoctrination factory. I find this one really funny because it doesn't seem to me like the people who make it have actually spent much time on a college campus. Sometimes there are people like Charlie Kirk who denounce college as a scam without having been to college. They don't really know what American colleges are like. But the fact about academia is that it's really not very radical at all. If you take college classes, you realize that professors are a pretty apolitical group of people for the most part. There are very few actual Marxists in the academy, and a lot of the majors that conservatives identify as being so scary and threatening, like gender studies and black studies, they're incredibly small departments. I mean, most students are marketing and business majors. They're taking, I mean, they might study history, they might study literature, but for the most part, if you look at the actual curriculum in a university, you'll find that it generally, for most people, is not very radical at all. People aren't reading Marxists, they're not reading leftists, they're not being indoctrinated. Once you actually go and you examine the syllabus at any major university, you find that the myths about what the university is like, they're just not true. They can't hold up when you look at the real world and you compare it to the conservative story of the real world. And one of the themes in this book is that conservatives often tell these stories about a scary world that exists out there, right? Where BLM activists are burning down every city in the country, or Antifa is everywhere. And then when you go outside, when you get off your when you get off InfoWars, you stop watching Fox News and you go out into the world and you look at the world, you find that the caricatures that they have drawn are, well, they're telling ghost stories. They're erecting kind of folk devils. So that's just a few arguments. I think you can see that it's pretty easy to demolish a lot of these conservative talking points, which raises the question, why do it in the first place? Well, one reason is because a lot of people believe them. It may be that you're watching this thinking, yes, it's obvious those talking points are terrible, they're wrong, it's very easy to refute them. But there are millions and millions of people who watch Fox News, or they listen to Donald Trump, who was the president of the United States, and maybe they voted for him, and they believe some of the stuff that I have in this book. One of the talking points is there's a war on cops. Maybe they defend the police and think Black Lives Matter is trying to destroy public safety. Maybe they think that poor people are responsible for their own poverty. Maybe they think that inequality is natural and fine. Maybe they think that we don't need a Green New Deal. Maybe they think that feminism is bad and hurts women and also men. And if they believe any of that, well, you can pick up this book and you'll have pretty effective ways of dealing with them in an argument or a conversation, and you'll know how to respond to them in ways that I think are going to be pretty difficult for them to reply to. So I encourage you to pick up the book, Responding to the Right. It's available right now from St. Martin's Press, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks very much.